Okay, let's unpack this. Here's a bit of a surprising stat for now. Something like 85 to 90% of new employees, they report feeling some level of discomfort when faced with new
Oh,
technology.
at a height. That's pretty widespread.
It really is. And it kind of hints at the topic we're doing a deep dive into today, technophobia. We've pulled together, a range of sources, articles, some research to really try and get under the skin of this unease around technology.
And what's interesting, I think, is that those feelings, that unease, especially
Mm.
now with tech evolving so fast, well, it might not be as unusual as you'd think. It seems like a pretty common human response, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here really is to look beyond just calling it a fear and explore where it comes from, its roots and the different ways it actually shows up.
Exactly. We're not really here to judge if it's right or wrong to feel that way. It's more about understanding it better. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is technophobia?
Well, looking at our sources, the kind of straightforward definition is a fear or dislike, maybe, of advanced technology or complex devices, things like computers, smartphones, tablets, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the word itself, it comes from Greek roots, techne, which means something like art, skill, or craft.
Ah, skill or craft.
Yeah. And phobos, which just means fear. So literally, a fear related to skill or craft.
That's interesting, especially when you think about how technology can sometimes replace those traditional skills, something we should definitely get into later.
For sure.
Now, is this fear always seen as like illogical or irrational?
That's a really good point. It often gets framed that way, yeah, as an irrational fear. But some people argue that, certain anxieties about tech are actually quite understandable.
Understandable how?
Well, when you think about potential downsides or maybe unintended consequences, it's not totally out of left field to be wary.
Mm.
And it's worth remembering there's an opposite too, technophilia.
Right, the love of technology.
Exactly. So there's definitely a whole spectrum of feelings here.
A whole range. Okay. Now, one of our sources mentioned a psychologist, Larry Rosen, who apparently identified different ways this technophobia can actually manifest. What did he find?
Yeah, Rosen described three main types, or maybe subcategories. First, you've got the uncomfortable users. These are people who might just feel overwhelmed or maybe not capable when they have to use new systems.
Okay, just sort of out of their depth.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Then there are the cognitive computer phobes. They tend to have more negative beliefs and thoughts about technology in general. It's more of a mindset thing.
Right. And the third?
The third are the anxious computer phobes. These folks actually experience physical anxiety symptoms like a racing heart, feeling nervous when they have to interact with technology.
Wow, okay. That really clarifies the different ways that anxiety can actually surface. So, thinking about where these kinds of feelings might have first really gained, widespread attention, where do we look?
Our sources definitely point toward the Industrial Revolution in England. That seems to be a really pivotal time.
How so?
Well, you had the development of all these new machines that could suddenly do the work of skilled craftspeople, but often using less skilled and definitely lower paid labor. And that, understandably, led to a lot of fear and resistance from people whose livelihoods were suddenly threatened.
And this brings us straight to the Luddites, doesn't it? A name most people have probably heard. What exactly were they doing?
Yeah, the Luddites. They were essentially a movement of British artisans back in the early 19th century. They organized specifically to oppose these new technologies, especially in the textile industry.
And they weren't subtle about it.
Not at all. They famously took direct action. That included smashing the machines themselves, particularly knitting frames. They also raided houses for supplies. They petitioned for better trade conditions, often with, threats of violence, either implied or explicit.
Sounds pretty intense. I read Parliament even made destroying machines a capital offense. Did that actually work? Did it stop them?
Well, not really. The unrest carried on for quite a while. But it's really crucial to understand why they were doing it.
Mhm.
The Luddites weren't necessarily against, like, all technology or all progress.
Right.
Their resistance was really focused on the technologies that were drastically changing their established trades, the nature of their skilled work, things that directly threatened their ability to earn a living.
So it's economic.
Fundamentally,
Yeah.
they argued that their skills, their labor, it was a form of property,
Mhm.
and it needed protection from being devalued by these new automated machines. So the fight wasn't just about the machines themselves, it was about economic survival.
That's a really important distinction. So the resistance wasn't aimed at the invention in isolation, but more how it was being used and the real world impact it had on their lives.
Okay, so moving through the 19th century, alongside all this industrial change, you also have this huge rise in modern science. How did that broader shift play into these fears about technology? Well, the 19th century was just a time of incredible upheaval, wasn't it? Driven by scientific breakthroughs, rapid technological innovation, and for a lot of people, that relentless pace of change was uh, deeply unsettling. It led to this kind of longing for what they saw as a simpler, maybe more stable past.
And that's where the Romantic movement comes in.
Exactly. The Romantic movement in art and literature really captures that feeling.
Right, the Romantics. They were all about imagination and feeling over pure reason, valuing the natural world. How did they view technology generally?
Precisely. Thinkers and artists from that era, people like William Wordsworth, William Blake, they often saw the big technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution as a kind of, well, a pollution or defilement of nature.
Which they held up as pure and beautiful.
Right. They championed the organic, the natural, the living as opposed to the mechanical, the artificial, the manufactured. It reflects a real deep unease with how industry was starting to dominate their world.
Okay, let's jump forward a bit. Post-World War II era. It feels like technology took on a whole new, maybe darker significance after that, didn't it? Especially with atomic weapons.
Oh, absolutely. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that had a massive impact. It just dramatically amplified fears about technology's potential for, immense destruction.
And that didn't just go away.
No, the nuclear arms race that followed, the whole Cold War, it created this pervasive anxiety about whether humanity could actually control the powerful technologies that it created.
And it wasn't only the huge world-ending threats, was it? Our sources also mention other things chipping away at public trust and technology.
That's right. Things like the corporate production of technologies for war during Vietnam napalm, for instance. That definitely eroded public confidence that tech progress was always a good thing.
Right.
And then at the same time, you had the rise of environmentalism, people becoming much more aware of air pollution, water pollution, the dangers of leaded gas, the ozone layer thinning, the beginnings of concerns about global warming.
All highlighting the downsides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It highlighted the very real potential for unchecked technological development to have serious, negative, and lasting consequences for the planet.
So it seems the reasons behind technophobia have kind of shifted over time, from worries about jobs in the 19th century to fears of global catastrophe and environmental harm in the 20th. What about how we see these fears reflected more recently, maybe in art, in pop culture?
Yeah, as technology gets more and more complex, and let's be honest, sometimes it feels like a bit of a black box, doesn't it?
Totally.
That can definitely fuel feelings of anxiety, a sense of lacking control. And our sources give some great examples in art that tap right into those fears. Think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
A classic, even though it's older.
Right, written much earlier, but it's often seen as this foundational story exploring the darker side of scientific ambition, the unintended consequences of playing God with technology, you could say.
Yeah, the creation turning on the creator.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful metaphor for tech getting out of hand. What about some more modern examples?
Well, in film, the Terminator is probably the ultimate technophobic nightmare, right? A self-aware AI deciding humanity needs wiping out.
Can't get much more direct than that.
Or you have something like the Twilight Zone episode, A Thing About Machines. That taps into a more everyday fear your household appliances turning against you.
Creepy. And even Doctor Who got in on this. You mentioned the Robots of Death episode. What was the specific fear there?
That one really played on the unease we feel with things that look human but lack human cues. The robots had no body language, no readable emotions, which made them seem really unsettling, untrustworthy. The doctor called them dead men walking.
Chilling.
And actually, the idea for the Cybermen, another famous Doctor Who villain, came from a similar place. The series consultant Kit Pedler was apparently worried about artificial limbs becoming so advanced.
That the line between human and machine would blur.
Exactly. That it would blur to the point where it changes our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human.
That is an unsettling thought. And then there are films like Virtuosity.
Yeah, where a virtual serial killer escapes into the real world. That plays on anxieties about the lines blurring between virtual and physical reality.
And Avatar, too, you mentioned. The Na'vi people hating technology.
Right, their deep fear and loathing of human technology. Which is pretty ironic considering the film itself was this huge leap forward in filmmaking technology.
Yeah, that is ironic.
But it really shows how, even as we embrace tech in making entertainment, we still tell stories that express these deep-seated fears about its impact on nature, our way of life.
So it seems these anxieties aren't just a Western thing either. Our sources mentioned a study looking at technophobia levels across different countries. What did that find?
Yeah, there was a study back in the early 90s. They surveyed first-year college students in 23 different countries. Overall, the average for high-level technophobia was around 29%.
Okay, nearly a third.
But, and this is the interesting part, there were huge variations between countries. Japan, for example, reported a really high rate, 58%. And Mexico was also very high at 53%.
Wow, that's much higher than the US rate, which was under 30% in that study. Any other countries stand out, high or low?
Yep. Indonesia, Poland, India, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, they also showed relatively high percentages. But then countries like Yugoslavia, Croatia, Singapore, Israel, Hungary had much lower rates.
So culture plays a big role.
It really suggests that, yeah, cultural and societal factors seem to shape how people view and interact with technology quite significantly. It's definitely not the same everywhere.
And it wasn't just students, was it? There was that statistic about new employees, too.
That's right. A report from 2000 suggested that somewhere around 85 to 90% of new employees might feel some level of discomfort with new tech in the workplace.
That really drives home how common this feeling is, even if it's just mild discomfort when faced with unfamiliar systems at work.
Absolutely. It's clearly not just some fringe phenomena.
Okay. So, beyond the Luddites, our sources also briefly mentioned other groups sometimes labeled technophobic, like the Amish. Is that fair? Is that an accurate description?
Well, it's a lot more nuanced than just slapping the label technophobic on them. The Amish and other similar Old Order Anabaptist groups, they practice something more like selective adoption of technology.
Selective adoption,
Meaning they make choices based on their deeply held cultural values,
Right.
what they call their ordinum, and their specific community goals. They don't just reject all technology out of hand.
So, how do they decide what gets in and what stays out?
They carefully think about how a particular technology might affect their community, their faith, their whole way of life. As one source puts it, more significantly, the Amish modify and adapt technology in creative ways to fit their cultural values and social goals.
They adapt it.
Yeah, Amish technologies are diverse, complicated, and ever-changing. Another quote says, "What the Amish do is selective use of modern technologies in order to maintain their belief and culture." So they're often really creative in how they adapt existing tech to fit their needs while sticking to their principles. It's very deliberate.
So, not a knee jerk no, but a really thoughtful, ongoing process of engagement with the tech world. Okay. Lastly, the sources just briefly listed some related ideas: anti-consumerism, the novel Erewhon, this idea of institutification, minimalism, neo-Luddism, even Ted Kaczynski, how they fit in.
Right. They all kind of tap into a broader web of related concerns, don't they? Concerns about the impact of technology and modern society, whether it's worries about too much consumption or the quality of online stuff declining or wanting a simpler life or much more radical rejections of the whole system.
So they're all part of this larger conversation or anxiety.
Exactly. They just highlight the many different angles people come from when questioning technological advancement.
Okay, so bringing this all together, technophobia, it's clearly not just one simple fear. It's got these deep historical roots right back to the Industrial Revolution through the nuclear age, and it shows up in so many ways.
Yeah, from individual anxiety to actual social movement.
We see it in our art, it varies across cultures, and crucially, it's often not about rejecting the invention itself, but about very real concerns over how it's used and its impact on people's lives and society.
That sums it up really well. And it does lead to a pretty big question, maybe for you, the listener, to think about. In a world that's just getting more and more tangled up with technology, how do we as societies strike that balance? Between the obvious benefits of progress and these very real, often valid fears and concerns people have.
Or maybe think about this. How do the stories we tell, from Frankenstein all the way to the Terminator, how do they not only reflect our anxieties about tech, but maybe also shape how we collectively understand it? It's definitely something to chew on.
Absolutely.
And if this deep dive has got you thinking, we definitely encourage you to maybe explore some of these examples further. Look into the Luddites' history, maybe reread Frankenstein, or find that creepy Twilight Zone episode. There's a lot more there.